Welcome to Short Course, episode 80 for October 28th, 2022. I'm your host, Ben Barry. This week I want to talk about the experience of and lessons learned from running the Chrono at the 2022 Carolina Classic. And to start off, it's a bit of an odd place to be because often Chrono is not necessarily a position that's really prioritized. And so, the question it comes up, why did I either volunteer for or get stuck with it? And the answer is I volunteered for it. As it happened, one of the things that could have been better at last year's Carolina Classic was the fact that the way we ran Chrono resulted in having to throw it out halfway through. And I thought to myself, everything else seems to be working okay. Maybe this is an area that I can step in and help. And so I volunteered to run the Chrono and try and do what I do when I approach anything, which is break it down, look at everything, try and figure out, does the way that we're doing each piece of it make sense? How can we make it better? How can we improve it? And that resulted in a number of positive outcomes, and I just wanted to go through those today. As a preface to this, I should say that this all somewhat started in 2019 when Stephanie Barry, my wife, took over as section coordinator. She'd actually stepped in the year before, but that was the first year that she was involved with overseeing the NC Section Championship. And we ran it at Sir Walter, and I made the suggestion that we should collect chrono ammo on one of the stages. And so what we ended up doing that year was on the stage that I was working, the last stage before chrono, we picked 8 rounds out of a mag that the competitor had used during the stage, put them in a Ziploc bag, and bundled them together. The one logistical hurdle in this case was that we were actually stage 9 at the top of the hill, and the Chrono was all the way at the bottom. So the best solution we could come up with was we actually just took all the Ziploc bags full of bullets, zip tied them together so that if somebody tried to pull theirs out and mess with it, hopefully it would be relatively obvious, and handed it to whoever the last shooter on the stage was. Did we think people were cheating? Probably not. But we thought, why not try and have a more robust system so that just in case somebody is, maybe we have a chance of catching them. And in that case, it worked out. I didn't hear about anybody going minor at the Chrono. Again, it's a local match. Even regionally around here, I don't know that anybody really is that interested in cheating for the glory of being North Carolina state champion. But it's more about the process. For me, it's about looking at the rules and saying, if I were going to cheat, what would be the biggest hole I would use to do it? And then saying, can we make the rules? Can we set the system in place such that it is more robust to whatever that opening is? Now, you're never going to get it to 0, but if you can close the biggest gaps, if you can pick the lowest hanging fruit, you can make it harder. And so to me, in a way, it was more about the challenge of how can we make this process better and better. And so we stuck with that same process of collecting ammo at the stage before Chrono through 2020 and 2021, which were the 2 years that the match has been hosted at Rowan. And so for this year, with me stepping in and taking a little more active role, I thought, okay, what's the next step? And what seemed natural to me was the idea of, instead of people knowing by now, if they had shot North Carolina, they would know that we probably would collect ammo from the stage right before Chrono. And so if I knew that, I would just make sure to use full power ammo on that stage, right? In this theoretical scenario, you have somebody who has some sub-minor ammo or some sub-major ammo, and they use it for most of their stages, but maybe they keep a magazine on their belt for when they get asked for their Chrono ammo. They give 8 rounds out of that magazine, and the rest of the day they can shoot whatever they want. So if somebody is doing that, the idea would be, rather than make it so if they wanted to, maybe now instead of having a single magazine of Chrono ammo, maybe they have a few, and they make sure to load up the mags for the stage before where they know the Chrono is going to be, because it's on the squad matrix. It's pretty obvious when you're going there, and so it's not really a secret or a surprise. And so at that point, once you clear Chrono, you're pretty much scot-free and you can shoot whatever ammo you want. And so the the idea that I came up with was basically to have Chrono not be something that you go to at a known time at a spot on the squad matrix. Just have somebody from the staff driving around, pull up to a stage, and whoever the current shooter on that stage is, when they're done, take 8 rounds of their ammo and tell them, you need to go to Chrono before the end of the match, or you shoot for no score. And you need to bring the gun that you're shooting. And we talked about different ways to, make sure they didn't change guns. But again, that's probably a pretty minor thing, really only relevant to maybe open, where you have different number of ports in the barrel that might affect power factor and that sort of thing. But we talked through a number of solutions for that. And the basic idea was, whether it's your first stage or your last stage, you have no guarantee that you won't be randomly sampled for Chrono at this stage. And so the idea is, whether or not we catch people at this match, if this becomes known, if this is the way that North Carolina runs Chrono, then it becomes really hard to cheat. And so why bother? And so the idea was to establish this, even if we weren't to actually catch anyone cheating, the idea would just be to establish this as the known thing, the way we run this match, and hopefully deter cheating, and to some degree set the example that possibly this could be used at larger matches. Now, as it happened, I had written up a proposal for this, and I had reviewed the Chrono appendix, which I couldn't find a rule that said that it couldn't be done this way. And it was pointed out to me after I submitted this. The range master, Mike Adams, pointed out that there's actually a rule in the competitor equipment chapter, of all places, that has a very explicit wording that says every competitor must be chronographed. And I tried to read that in as many ways as I could. I even ended up emailing Troy and trying to see if there was any room for an interpretation in there to basically say, well, every competitor that you do chronograph, power factor has to be ascertained via chronograph. But I was basically trying to find a way around this every competitor rule. And what he came to, which is the plain reading of the rule, is no. The rule says every, so it's got to be every. Now, you might want to change that, and I think it's hopefully something worth discussing. But what I found just particularly shocking from the whole exchange was his attitude, where he was saying, it seems like you think people at your match are cheating, and if that's the case, then I want to know about it, and why do you think everybody's cheating? What are you so worried about? And I'll post, I actually have a blog post up with the email conversation, because I think it's pretty interesting. I was very surprised by his reaction. Like I say in the intro to the blog post, if he had just said, hey, here's the rule, there's no leeway, that's that, then all right, fine, move on. But it was the fact that he said repeatedly that he wasn't worried about this kind of cheating, and why am I worried about it either, that really jumped out to me. And again, I have no idea if anybody's doing this. I just know, as someone who looks at rules from the outside and thinks where the gaps are, if I wanted to cheat, it would be very easy to do so. But anyway, you can go read that blog post, make your own decisions. But as it is, there is a rule in the, I think it's 5.6.1, that says every competitor has to be chronographed. So that was what it was. Nothing we could do about that one. All that really left was to say, okay, within that restriction, how can we make the Chrono as good as possible? As good being a balance of, if someone were trying to cheat, at least making it difficult for them to do that, while also making it efficient and trying to catch all kinds of rules violations, not just the obvious ones. So looking back at the previous years, another thing that I wasn't particularly happy with about the way that, just due to circumstances that we'd had to run Chrono, was the idea of taking declared bullet weight, which is the competitor can show up with whatever ammo they want, and you shoot it over the Chrono and determine its velocity, but they can tell you what the bullet weight is, and you're not verifying it. As it was, that was just a logistical thing. It was kind of perceived at the time that it took too long to pull the bullets, and that was one of the things that, as I stepped in and was taking over this responsibility, I was looking at ways to fix that. I was trying to say, how can we actually pull bullets in a way that keeps up with shooters coming through Chrono? And this is one reason that it's common at matches to just have competitors at the beginning of their first stage, everybody's just handed a Ziploc bag and told, hey, put 8 bullets in this bag and we'll send it to Chrono. what that does is it gets all the bullets to Chrono well ahead of the competitors, and so it means that the people at Chrono can go ahead and pull those bullets. Typically, what I've seen done is they use the hammer kinetic pullers, which you kind of need time to use because they're pretty slow and they're annoying, and your arm gets tired doing that for a while. And so to me, that approach of just asking competitors at their first stage, hey, give me some bullets out of whatever mag you want, was not going to cut the mustard. And so I knew that we would need an approach where competitors were, like before, coming from a stage where the bullets had been gathered from the stage where they had used it. That at least was working from previous years, so I wanted to keep that going. And so the question is, how can you speed up the process of pulling a bullet? And so I looked around, and what I eventually hit upon was this idea of an RCBS bullet puller that uses a collet that's meant to be mounted into a reloading press. And I thought to myself, well, we can put a single stage press on the range, or Lee makes this $50 hand press that theoretically they say is, I guess, for loading test ammo on the range. Whatever. I can't imagine doing that, but that's what they sell it for. But it wasn't that expensive. And so we bought one and the RCBS collet puller, and just in my garage, I just got kind of into the rhythm of being able to pull bullets from the random bucket of live rounds that had just collected on my reloading bench. And, things it worked. It actually worked surprisingly well. I found it much faster than using the hammer puller. You had to have a little bit of finesse with tightening it down and on certain different bullet types, but I was able to get the hang of it within 20 or 30 bullets, just kind of practicing in my garage. So I thought, okay, this is going to work. We can actually pull bullets this year without having to use the hammer pullers, or at least the hammer pullers will be the backup. Most of the stuff we can do with this collet puller. And we ended up doing it. Every single shooter that came through Chrono ended up having their bullet pulled by that RCBS puller. Now, we did end up, because John Royer, the match director, happened to have a Lee single stage press, and we had a little wooden stand that we were able to screw it to, we did actually end up switching over to using that single stage press. But when I was preparing for this scenario, I was expecting that we would have some plastic folding tables, not anything that we could really mount an actual proper press to. But I definitely think having it in the press made it even faster. It just, the process was completely seamless. And so that would definitely be my recommendation. For example, I can't imagine why Nationals doesn't just have a setup like this. It would cost maybe $150 for the press, some lumber to build a stand to mount it to. You get the RCBS collet puller itself with the collets for 9, 40, and 45. With the Lee presses, the way their shell plates work, the 9 and the 40 shell plates, you only need one of those, and then a 45 shell plate. The whole thing all in was under $150. And it was fast, it was easy, and it didn't require us to get the bullets submitted ahead of time. So that to me was a huge win. I still think the hand press could have worked. I kind of got the hang of it, but as it happened, I actually ended up being paired with Stephanie for a good part of the match just because of shortages, and she was able to jump in and help for a good chunk of it. And I'll admit, it definitely does require some hand strength and kind of wears on you. The thing definitely is, it's got pokey bits on it, so it's not the most comfortable thing. And having the single stage press was definitely an upgrade if you can swing it. If you have somewhere that you can mount it near your Chrono station, it makes pulling the bullet take no time at all. The way that we managed actually collecting the ammo, I think, worked well. This year, the main thing that we changed was, instead of having Ziplocs that we put the bullets in, we actually had they're called cash transmittal bags. And they're basically, it's a kind of plastic bag with a strip that you can peel off, and then it has some really sticky adhesive underneath it. And the idea is, once you seal it with that sticky adhesive, you can't undo the adhesive, and so the only way to get anything out of the bag is that you have to rip the bag, and then it's pretty obvious that you've tampered with it. And so we were able to buy a couple hundred of these bags, one for every competitor plus 20% or whatever. And the stage that we were right next to the RO would keep one in his back pocket for each shooter, and after the unload and show clear and range is clear, but before anybody goes down range to score and paste, which with staff reset means only the staff are going down range anyway. Before anyone went down range, The RO would just hold up the shooter and say, I need 8 rounds from that magazine. Sometimes it would be the magazine he used during the stage. Sometimes the RO would actually point to another magazine on their belt. So the stage in question was a short speed shoot. There were 3 poppers, 4 paper, so 11 rounds, I think. And so you could easily do it with one magazine. But the idea by picking a random mag off the belt sometimes was maybe you have 1 mag of chrono ammo, but do you have a whole belt full of chrono ammo? Again, as it was, we didn't end up catching anybody. Nobody went sub-minor, and so nobody was caught by this process. But by people going through it, I think it builds the impression that North Carolina is not a match to mess around with these things at. There might be matches where you can get away with this kind of thing, but it's not us. And so in one sense, you can say we failed because we didn't catch anybody cheating. But on the other hand, I think you can say that we succeeded in that if anybody were likely to cheat, they were deterred. Or they were successful in gaming the system and maybe they just had 1 mag of chrono ammo and they managed to put their bullets in the bag from that 1 mag. Who knows? But anyway, the cash transmittal bags were a cheap solution, and they solved the problem of having to chaperone the shooter from the bay over to Chrono, which it was only the other side of a concrete wall, but it did save one person having to basically stand there and make sure they didn't go to their bag and try and swap the ammo out from something in their bag. Because once the rounds were sealed in that bag, if they showed up to Chrono with a ripped bag, at that point we would have had some serious questions. And nobody did. They just walked right over. But there were also times when we would have a small backlog of 1 or 2 or 3 shooters, and we weren't having to watch them like a hawk because, again, we were pretty confident when they stepped up and handed us this sealed bag, it hadn't been tampered with. So, one of those places where an innovation outside of shooting can really pay dividends. I think we'll be doing that again if we run Chrono this way. It was, again, they're not that expensive, and it just gives that little bit of confidence that people aren't tampering with the sample that you've collected. The other big sort of equipment change that we did make this year was switching to using a lab radar chrono. So we had a pair of the CED 3000, 2000, whatever fancy chronos, and they had a plywood box that they lived in, and we had to find somewhere to store the plywood box for every weekend around the calendar that we weren't actually using it, which was 51 out of the 52. And that was kind of a pain in the butt, and they were finicky. We had issues with the light bars getting shot, and when the opportunity came to pick up one of the lab radar, it's actually the light model, so it doesn't have Bluetooth, which is perfectly fine for our needs because we're not trying to sync it to one of the chrono officers' phones or something. And it did cost basically about what 2 regular chronos would cost, but it's a one-time investment for the section, which is nice. So wherever the section goes, now we have it. And the section had already invested in the chronos, the other chronos, which were just sitting unused, again, 51 out of the 52 weeks of the year. But I have to say, the lab radar was everything I'd hoped it would be. As it happened, we did end up having a spare, so we were actually able to run 2 side by side, and if you position them correctly, both of them can pick up a single shot. And I will say they both were very close to each other on all the readings. They were within 5 or 10 feet per second on almost every reading, and just having one probably would have been completely sufficient. We maybe had 5 or 6 shots that just didn't get any kind of registration on one of the chronos, where it was nice to have the second. But that's a better success rate than I've seen from a lot of the light-based chronos. So it definitely, if you had to choose between 2 light-based chronos and building a box or having 1 lab radar, I think you would be better off going with just the 1 lab radar. The rulebook says it's better to have 2, and yeah, if you can swing having 2, if somebody has one that they can bring, so that's what our situation was. The second one belonged to Nathan Carter of Shooting Sports Innovations, and he just let us borrow it for the weekend, and it worked great to have both of them. If you can do that, I think that's really the best setup you can hope for. The only real drawback or downside or gotcha that I found, well, there's 2. One is PCCs. obviously, especially the quieter ones, have trouble setting off the mic, which the lab radar then uses to start trying to detect the bullet. So it's sending out a certain amount of radar pulses at all times, but when it actually detects a shot from a loud noise next to its internal microphones, then it actually starts recording and looking for the bullet. And basically what I found is with maybe half the PCCs, it was no issue. It would set off both lab radars. And I would say with about half or so of them, I basically had to get the muzzle, and they recommend you have the muzzle of the gun no closer than 6 inches to the lab radar. But I had to get the muzzle maybe 2 inches away, right next to the internal microphone, which is just right at the 3 o'clock or the 9 o'clock position on the box. And once I did that, it would pick up the shot. Now, at that point, only one of the lab radars was picking them up anyway. But when it did that, we got a good reading off that one, and there were no issues with doing that. So in that sense, that was one of the places where having a second one didn't really do much for us, because with a lot of the quieter PCCs, we were only getting a reading off of one anyway. But once we got it right next to the one lab radar, it picked up fine. And then the second issue is just aiming the thing. So you do want it to be aimed at the target you're shooting at, just because of the way it picks up the bullet traveling, and it's having to do the trigonometry on what its path is that it's taking. And so for most shooters, I would actually, or at least once per squad, I would get behind the little sights on top of the lab radar and make sure that it was pointed at the target that we had about 15 or 20 yards downrange for this purpose, and just make sure that it was lined up. Because if the thing does get bumped or jostled and it's pointing in the wrong spot, you're going to get very low readings by like 200 or 300 feet per second. So it should be pretty obvious, but it's definitely something you need to watch out for. And it's they have a little folding tripod that they sell that has some good locking adjustments on it that I found to be pretty reliable. And then the second thing is you can actually 3D print it's like a little almost soda straw type thing that goes on top. It basically replaces where the normal little V-notch gutter sight goes. But just even having that little tube to aim down versus the V, it gave me a little more confidence that the thing was pointed in the right spot. And again, I made sure that it was that way for all the shooters, and we got good readings for every shot. And so, yeah, I couldn't be happier with that. The other part of the way that we ran Chrono this year was really trying to actually check everything that the rulebook says you should check. So not just weighing the gun and boxing it, but doing some equipment check of the belt, checking that the guns, if the primary safety is active or not disabled. And that definitely took a little bit of figuring out sort of the right order of operations to do that in. Now, the one thing that we couldn't do was to gauge every magazine. And I couldn't come up with a good process to actually do that. I think if you really want to check competitors' magazines, you need to be gauging them on the stages. And so the way we had it, we just had the competitor come up with their gun and an empty magazine. And depending on the division, we'd either weigh it with the empty magazine, gauge the magazine, that kind of thing. And what I found was the best sort of order of operations to go through things in was have them step up and then tell them to put the gun on the mat with an empty magazine, and then take the gun, do whatever checks needed to be done to the gun. So gauging the mag, weighing the gun. And I actually had a checklist that I hand wrote the first night or the first day. And then we actually did it that night. We went to the hotel little business center, typed it up and printed it out. And so I had it taped to the table in front of me, which was actually really helpful because occasionally the competitor would banter with you or you would be distracted by something or another. And just being able to go back to the checklist and just say, okay, production, weigh it, check for list compliance, all of these things, just having a little checklist per division and being able to refer to that and make sure you hadn't missed anything, and having them honestly in order too of the things that were most efficient to check worked out pretty well. Most of the stuff was pretty standard. Some folks were surprised. I weighed almost every gun. Towards the end, if I felt like, it was a production gun, it was obviously a plastic gun with no modifications. Some of them I skipped throwing them on the scale, but for a lot of them I would just go through the process, especially if we were running ahead of schedule, just in the interest of thoroughness, and weigh it, box it. I did in accordance with the rules, I did check that the primary safety was functional and not disabled on, well, all guns. Obviously, if the thumb safety on an open or limited gun were disabled or non-functional, that would be an issue. And for the most part, it was no issue. So obviously, anything that had a thumb safety, I just checked that with the hammer back and the thumb safety on, it blocked activation of the hammer. If it was a striker gun with a trigger safety where there was some part of the trigger that had to be depressed for the whole body of the trigger to move, I would just make sure the rest of the trigger couldn't move unless that lever was depressed. No issues there, and it didn't take very long at all. Again, by having things in a sort of rhythm, by just being able to go through them, this, then that, then this, then that, it didn't take very long at all. And what was nice is while I was doing this, whoever was helping me, either Stephanie or John Royer, the match director, who ended up tag teaming just as either of them had availability. They were able to pull the bullet and weigh it and get that entered into the tablet and be ready to start shooting and capture the velocities. So the person on the sort of left seat would take the bag, cut it open, take a bullet, pull it, weigh it, and then they would have the tablet. They type in the bullet weight and then be ready to read the velocities. And in some cases, they would have time to even load a few bullets in the magazine for me. So I would make sure to, if it was a division that had a gauged magazine, I would make sure to gauge the magazine first so that it was available so the other person could pick it up and load rounds if they had time. And then from there, I would dry fire the gun a few times, and then I would load the magazine with a few bullets in it, shoot it over the chrono. I think we only had 2 or 3 that we even needed to shoot additional rounds, and then unload the gun. I would then lay it down on the mat and have the competitor step up, holster it, and then stand right where they were and just do a quick equipment check. So take an overlay, make sure that the butt of the handgun is at or above the top of their belt, and then depending on what division they're in, check if the distance from the inside of the inner belt to the inside of the handgun matched the division requirements. And that's the one that caught the most people. Now, in every case, they were able to fix it and continue on in the match. So it was more just people kind of having their match flow disrupted by having to bring their gear back into compliance, which is the way the rules are written. But there was a real sense that people were not expecting to have that checked. And in most cases, I had to explain to folks what the rules were and what they had to do to get the gun back into compliance. In most cases, it was the holster, not the gun. You can't really change the gun itself at that point. And at that point, once I declared the equipment check a pass, the person running the tablet would turn it over to the competitor to review and hit approve, and then they would be on their way. And by the middle of Saturday, we had this down to 90 seconds or less. It was very efficient, and we were easily able to keep up with the stage in front of us. Now, there are always going to be some backups if you do have somebody that you need to shoot some extra rounds for, or you have an issue where their gear is out of compliance, and so you have to, everything doesn't go smoothly. So there will be backups for that. But when everybody was just breezing through, we were able to pull the bullet, weigh it, do I think check every gear thing in the rule book aside from gauging every single magazine. That's really the only thing we could have done more. We were checking safeties, weighing, boxing, anything that the rule book required, and then load a few rounds, shoot them over the chrono, enter the velocities, and off they went. One thing that was definitely a topic of, some friction or resistance was, I guess people at some matches have gotten used to expecting to walk up to chrono and be given the command, make ready. And there is a recommendation, but not a requirement in the rule book that chrono should be run that way, that when the competitor steps up, they should be told to make ready. And in my personal opinion, that is just confusing. If you know what it already means, then great. But when they would come up to my chrono station, I would stand up, I would look at them, I would indicate the mat on the table in between us, and I would say, lay your gun and an empty magazine on the mat in a sort of flat, range officer kind of tone, just like that. And I got maybe a handful of folks saying, are we good? Or is that make ready? And I would just repeat the command, because to me, make ready means load the gun and make it ready for a stage. It doesn't mean do what, the chrono station has a separate set of requirements. And it's worth noting for PCC, because I found that this was an issue, I would tell them, lay your carbine on the mat with the flag out and the dot on, because I had a few where I was, trying to unflag their PCC, or the dot wasn't on or something like that. And so by giving them that specific command, again, it got things into a place where we could just start testing the gun and move on with the process. I know this is probably going to be a debate that continues. If you know what someone means by make ready, well, then the meaning of make ready is clear. But if you don't, then to me, just giving simple, straightforward range commands that declare what you would like the competitor to do in a safe way, to me, that's just better. And so I went that route. Again, there were a few people that kind of questioned, asked that, okay, are we good? And I would say, yep, we're good, and repeat the command. And then at the end, I would tell them, step up, holster the handgun, stand right where you are for equipment check, which most people understood meant just freeze right on the spot. And because I was on the right side of them for all the right-handed shooters, then I could just take the overlay, do the quick equipment check, and call out equipment check as a pass and move on. And so that process worked really well for us. If I were to do it again, I would run it that way. But I know that this is a somewhat controversial opinion, because some people think make ready is the only command, and I just don't see it that way. As for how everything actually ran, like I said, there were a good number, maybe 10, 20 people that we had to get them to adjust their holster position just because they were not aware of the equipment rules. And in one case, one guy said, I just won this holster bracket at some area match, and I just put it on, and this is my first time using it. I didn't even realize that this was an issue. It's like, well, okay. I mean, that is what it is, but here's the rules. There's the safe area. Here's what you've got to get it into compliance with. Come back when you've fixed it, and we will allow you on in the competition, but you can't start your next stage until this is fixed. Those are the most common ones. We'd have one guy, his open mags just didn't fit the gauge. He said they'd passed at some other big match. They passed the gauge there, but they didn't pass our gauge, and he had two of them, and they both didn't pass. And so, it is what it is. The one that was definitely the most sort of eventful issue is we did have a carry optics shooter shooting a Shadow 2 come through, and like I said, just part of the routine, part of my checklist was check that the primary safety is functional. And I was actually pretty surprised when I racked the slide to cock the hammer, put the thumb safety on this nicely worked out Shadow 2, pulled the trigger, and the trigger fell. And so at that point, called over the range master, talked to the competitor, and what we ended up coming down to was the gun is considered unsafe, and it has to either be repaired or he has to go to his backup gun. But this gun, in its current state, he cannot continue in the match. And I did actually email NROI and verify that was the right call, and they confirmed, yes, it's unsafe gun. You can't continue, either repair or replace it. And it was funny because this guy is his main match gun. He mentioned some custom gun builder, and he said it was like he paid like $3,000 for the Shadow 2, which is obviously quite a bit more than they actually cost. So it had a lot of work done to it. And I guess one of the things was, whatever the trigger work was, it ended up disabling the thumb safety. But he had a backup gun. The thumb safety worked on the backup gun. We chronoed that, sent him on his way, and it was all good. So that was definitely one of those areas where the rules are not crystal clear. I mean, the division rules for production and carry optics say the primary safety must be functional, but they don't say necessarily what the implication is, what the ruling is if that's not met. In a lot of cases, if you don't meet the division requirements, you're bumped to open, but this is not one of those times, apparently. So other than that, everything went smoothly. Like I said, we were able to keep up. We didn't have any issues with people making their declared power factor. We just had the one issue with the magazines that didn't fit. And overall, I think this really gave us some good lessons learned. We hopefully have a template to follow in the future. Now, if we were running another big match tomorrow, the big thing the big kind of gap in the way we run things this way is you're doing equipment check whenever you come to Chrono, which for some folks was pretty late in the day. I do think at a big match, you should absolutely have someone or everyone on each bay that knows the equipment rules and can just do a quick equipment check. Just make sure gun, holster, magazine positions are all legal before you even start the first stage. And I know there are a lot of matches that, especially bigger matches, that do that. It's not something that we've done, but that's something definitely that I'll be recommending or looking into how we can do something like that next time. Because again, we did catch some folks coming through equipment check and made them fix the issues. But if we could have caught it before the first for their first stage of the day, obviously that would have been better. The only trick being it's not extremely complicated, but there is a little bit of nuance to how exactly the measurements are done, where the measurement is taken, what you're looking for in terms of for the height measurement, it's the heel of the gun that has to be above the belt. But for the distance from the belt measurement, it's any part of the grip, but not, but safeties don't count. And so just a quick refresher on exactly what you're looking for, what's in compliance, what's out of compliance, and then having someone on each bay before each squad starts just review the competitors on their bay, I think would go a long way to fixing these issues, because then the competitors can do it potentially before they even start shooting, which would be ideal. And then obviously, long term, I hope that we can get to a spot where the rules allow, they don't require, but they allow for some kind of random sampling. I genuinely think that having people sort of go single file through Chrono, knowing when it's going to come, it's a way to cheat if you wanted to. And I think potentially you could have a less of a backup. Your match flow could be significantly better by not having to spend the time to send everybody to Chrono, and you just have to sample 10%, 20% of your competitors in each flight. Make sure they go to Chrono before they leave the range, so either over lunch or at the end of the day, or if they have time, which during a staff reset match they would, in between stages, if they can come over to Chrono, they shoot one stage, they're done, they load their mags, and we've already collected their bullets from another stage, but they come over to Chrono, and while the staff on their bay keep running the squad, right, they're not needed on that bay for reset to help their squad out, but their squad can keep running while they come over to Chrono on any of the bays nearby. I mean, at Rowan, there's easily 4 bays within a quick walk of where we were hosting Chrono. So if someone had their bullets pulled, and then as they work through, they don't have to wait till the end of the day to come to actually shoot the bullets that we randomly pulled. They can do it in the middle of the day, thanks to staff reset. So I think there's a real opportunity here. It, bums me out that we weren't able to run it that way, but on the whole, I still think we did the best we could with the way the rules are written currently. I think the process that we worked out was quick and efficient, and I would definitely recommend to do it again. If you have any questions, if you want to connect the Chrono guy at your match with me and talk over things or ask questions, you have my email. Just send them to me, and I'll do whatever I can. Do I think cheating is utterly rampant in USPSA? No, but I think everybody who is playing on the level appreciates having the confidence that everybody else is playing fair too. And so to me, it's more about respect and fairness, and just making sure that if somebody ill-intentioned did want to come in and try and cheat at our sport, which there have been a couple of those over the years, a couple of them from North Carolina, in fact, they would have a hard time. You're never going to stop people if they're really dedicated, but I want to at least make it as difficult as I can without making it overly difficult on the match staff. And to be totally honest, I think random sampling Chrono would be easier on the match staff than this process of trying to get people through on a fixed schedule. But the rules say every competitor right now, and so we'll keep following the rules for as long as those are the rules. Well, that wraps up this episode of Short Course. If you want to get in touch with me, my email is podcast@barryshooting.com. Talk to you next time.